Yeah, so I'm Manny. I'm going to be presenting on the Hart-Dworkin debate and some historical work that I've done that critiques specifically legal positivism and H.L.A. Hart. I know that most people don't know what the Hart-Dworkin debate is if you've not had much of an interest in philosophy of law. But it's a very significant debate that really defined the field of legal philosophy for pretty much since, since the 60s when Ronald Dworkin first critiqued Hart. And to give some idea of the consequences of this debate for practical purposes like legal interpretation that Bryson was just talking about. The conceptual core, the Hart-Dworkin debate is, I'm going to read my paper in just a second, and I'll be a little bit more articulate about all this, but just to give this first little overview, it's a debate about the relationship between law and morality. Hart and legal positivists hold the position that law is dependent entirely on social facts, whereas Dworkin and his supporters argue that law is also dependent on moral facts. And a lot of what my research has been on is sort of critiquing what exactly is meant by moral facts, what exactly is meant by social facts. And I have sort of located that part of the problem with this comes down to the fact-value dichotomy and the influence that it has wielded over all sorts of disciplines, including economics, and in this case, law. So about 20 years ago, Hilary Putnam wrote a book called The Collapse of the Fact-Value Dichotomy. And I am essentially taking Putnam's critique of the fact-value dichotomy and I'm applying it to law in the way that he applies it to economics in that book. He writes about how John Smith's Wealth of Nations was totally minimized into being a theory of economics that was entirely divorced from any conception of value. And so classical economics became a way of doing economics and a model for economic thought that ignored value entirely. But this has come in under criticism by what do you call somebody who studies economics? And economists, thank you. Economists like Amartya Sen, who will talk about something like welfare economics and how it's pretty undeniable that what $1,000 is to Bill Gates is less valuable to somebody who lives below the poverty line. That's just one example of how the fact-value dichotomy, as Putnam would say, has really just corrupted the way the tradition of analytic philosophy and all sorts of disciplines in social sciences have just been negatively impacted by this thesis and what it turned into, not necessarily what Hume intended for it to be. So in a nutshell, Hart and legal positivists like him argue that the content of law is determined by social facts and not moral ones, while Dworkin argues that law is determined by moral facts as well as social facts. One way to clarify and articulate the practical significance of this is by, I won't read this, I already said that. Thanks, everybody. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to jump into the fact-value dichotomy and its influence on legal positivism. We can understand legal positivism's divorce between law and morality through an understanding of how the empiricist philosophers of the 18th century treated normativity as a subject of study more broadly. Modern legal positivism originated with the thought of Jeremy Bentham and John Austin, both whom belonged to the empiricist tradition and whose philosophical methodology was shaped by the fact-value dichotomy. The origin of the fact-value dichotomy is typically associated with David Hume, but is characteristic of the general currents of philosophy in the early modern period. The modern paradigm shifted away from the common view of ancient and medieval thinkers that all things have natures, inherent purposes, and value. Hume and his contemporaries wrote under the influence of the Enlightenment, and great skepticism began to form around inquiries into the unobservable. Am I cut off?
Can you hold it just a little bit further away from me?
Absolutely, yeah. As the Newtonian revolution promised to master our understanding of the physical universe through the scientific method, what status was left for the study of categories like mind, morality, will, and soul, which evaded the grasp of science? Hume wrote of this difficulty on the subject of morality, which would go to famously instantiate the fact-value dichotomy, also sometimes referred to as Hume's law or Hume's principle. So Hume writes, in every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary ways of reasoning and establishes the being of a god, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when all of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual populations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected. I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. So Hume is asserting here that you cannot derive an ought from an is, or an is from an ought. In doing so, he is separating philosophical inquiry into two separate realms of values and facts. In the realm of facts, epistemological norms, like the laws of logic, are defined and affirmed by their ability to establish objective truths about reality, while empirical data presents the subject matter for this scheme of inquiry. But we cannot move from this realm of inquiry to a realm of value or morality, or this is at least how what the fact-value dichotomy developed into. And this sets the conceptual stage for the birth of legal positivism. So the fact-value dichotomy left in the empiricist paradigm of philosophy with strict methodological constraints for pursuing a philosophy of ethics or justice. The political theorists of the empiricist tradition, like Mill and Bentham, thus derived political morality for what could be ultimately defined by psychological states. You could reduce these psychological states, at least in theory, to material phenomenon, like a brain state. For Mill, the ideal political system would be one which promoted the most human happiness, not goodness. For Bentham and Austin, law did not depend on moral principles for its force, but rather fear of punishment. Austin originally formulated legal positivism as the command theory view that law is orders backed by threats. So Hart's great contribution to legal positivism, Hart comes in the 20th century, about 100 years after Austin, not quite that much, but his great contribution, which sort of defined modern and contemporary legal positivism, is the development of the internal point of view in law. So he recognized that Austin's view that we obey law out of fear for punishment mismatched with the lived experience of engaging with a legal system. So he categorized this view as the externalized view of the law, this order backed by threats view of law. For example, when I'm driving over the speed limit and I slow down at the side of a police car. And in contrast, he identified an internal point of view of law in which we have a sense of obligation to obey the law for the sake of obeying the law and no other reason. This internal viewpoint recognizes that we often respect law even when we distinguish it from an obligation to morality. It applies to respect for the structures of legal institutions in a broad sense. Chief among these is what Hart calls the rule of recognition. The rule of recognition refers to the criteria for identifying valid laws in a legal system, such as identifying what counts as a valid source of authority for establishing law. The rule of recognition is part of what Dworkin calls the pedigree thesis of legal positivism. Of these three theses, which Dworkin subscribes to positivism in his premier critique of legal positivism, this is the one that Scott Shapiro, a prominent contemporary legal positivist, agrees is core to the legal positivist position. And the pedigree thesis, in its broadest formulation, states that there is a master rule which determines what constitutes law, social facts. Shapiro emphasized that for legal positivists, the criteria, quote, the criteria of legality set out by the master rule may refer only to social facts. The master rule of any legal system may not set out criteria of legality that either refer to a norm's moral properties or require for their implementation the exercise of moral reasoning. No master rule, therefore, may condition legality on morality. This allows for a cursory understanding of the legal positivist position to develop. Legal positivists are committed to the view that law is ultimately derived from extramoral social facts. The definition of social facts extends to internalized senses of obligation to obey the law and respect rules which determine what constitutes law. Many legal positivists have read Hobbes as a legal positivist, and this discloses something about the category of social facts which they employ. Hobbes famously wrote that in a state that in a state of nature there are no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all the continual fear of danger, of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is in our self-interest, therefore, to surrender our natural freedom to live under the protection of the sovereign. Hobbes's project of accounting for the origins of political community through social contract appeals to legal positivists because at least this cursory overview of Hobbes allows for an account of political power through the resolution of emotional tensions or psychological tensions, which the positivist can read as extramoral social facts. So some outside the positivist tradition have called this reading of Hobbes into question. It's not consequential for the purposes of this paper to take sides on whether Hobbes should be read as a positivist or not, but this tension is revealing of something. There is a fundamental disagreement as to whether the obligations between sovereigns and subjects can be reduced to the category of extramoral social facts or whether they are moral obligations in some sense. So what is morality for the legal positivist if this reduces to social fact? The category of morality is something that Hart left undefined intentionally. I have a big quote where he talks about this, but basically he just talks about how it's such a philosophically difficult question that it's not worth even attacking. And ostensibly, the legal positivist position didn't need a definition of morality. If facts like the force of law could only be derived from other facts and not values, morality being included in this realm, then legal positivists only needed to identify what these facts are. The category of social facts becomes extremely useful for this purpose because it supposedly allowed for phenomena associated with internal states of mind, experiences of emotion, desire, etc., to count as facts. The logic seems to work if we can reduce this phenomenon to a kind of physicalism corresponding to states of brain chemistry, patterns of neurons firing in the brain, and so on. If these phenomena can be reduced to material states, then they can at least theoretically be the subject of empirical inquiry and be established as facts. If a ground-up theory about the origins of political community and the force of law can be established entirely with facts, why would legal positivists need to burden themselves with a theory of moral ontology? This intention of Hart and other legal positivists to remain neutral on defining a moral ontology fails at least in part from the outset. If the category of social facts encompasses internalized senses of obligation and complex emotional states like insecurity and the desire to be relieved from it, then these phenomena have been excluded from the domain of morality. If an internal sense of obligation to obey the law has nothing to do with morality, does an internal sense of obligation to act morally have anything to do with morality either? If morality is something latent in our social dynamics, if it is at least in part a function of our emotional states, does this not undermine the position of legal positivists or even the fact-value dichotomy itself? These questions will be addressed in the next section. So the collapse of the fact-value dichotomy. As legal positivists remain tethered to the fact-value dichotomy in the 21st century, many philosophers are skeptical of it if they haven't moved past it entirely. Hilary Putnam wrote an excellent tour de force of the dichotomy's rise with Hume and the empiricists in the 18th century and its fall in the latter half of the 20th century, beginning with W.B. Quine's famous critique in Two Dogmas of Empiricism, which some people have called the most famous philosophical paper of the entire 20th century. I don't think I would agree with that necessarily, but Putnam applies this to a critique of how many economists have come to interpret classical economics as a value-free enterprise, observing how Adam Smith's theory was pigeonholed into the fact-value dichotomy, similarly to the observation made in this paper about legal positivists' treatment of Hobbes. We can take from Putnam's critique that Hume himself would not have categorized the legal positivist category of social facts as facts. Since Hume's initial employment of the fact-value dichotomy, the dichotomy went under a significant metaphysical inflation from what Hume intended. Hume was highly skeptical about the usefulness of synthetic judgments in general. On Hume's account, facts about the world could only be established through the observations of the senses. There was nothing that could be sensibly observed about values, so there was no way that anything factual could be said about them. But Hume's skepticism was so extreme that he rejected the idea that causation itself could be established as fact. All we really observed, he believed, are correlations between events. So what legal positivists have called social facts, Hume wouldn't have regarded as facts at all. There is nothing that can be sensibly observed through our senses of sight, hearing, touch, taste, or smell, about emotional states or beliefs about obligation. What Hume's skepticism of causation while Hume's skepticism of causation did not make its way into contemporary positivist methodology, the entire project of legal positivism, project of legal positivism is to explain the causal relationships which bring about law's existence, parentheses. The fact-value dichotomy did make its way into contemporary legal positivism. As a metaphysical standpoint, values did not account for facts about reality, in this case, facts about law. So on Putnam's account, the fact-value dichotomy should be understood as the thesis that judgments about values differ from judgments of other sorts. It certainly does not seem that we should maintain that judgments about values differ from judgments about, to use Putnam's example, judgments in the field of chemistry. When we understand the fact-value dichotomy in this way, it naturally calls us to be critical of the unjustified, metaphysically inflated notion of the fact-value dichotomy, which rejects an interplay between values and facts. It seems to be a reinstantiation of earlier philosophical paradigms, which bifurcated realms of reality into the natural and the supernatural. Legal positivists don't seem to think that their position requires them to defend why an internal sense of obligation is not moral in nature, and this points to how the fact-value dichotomy has been taken for granted in scientific and philosophical thought. As Putnam lamented, this dichotomy of facts versus value judgment has corrupted our thinking, this is a quote, has corrupted our thinking about both ethical reasoning and description of the world, not least of all by preventing us from seeing how evaluation and description are interwoven and interdependent. So I have 15 seconds left. I'm not going to do any more in my paper, but the rest of my project that I'm working on is trying to demonstrate how I believe, trying to argue that Dworkin's theory sort of tacitly breaks the fact-value dichotomy, and the significance of this, even though that methodological shift is never addressed by the two thinkers, and I can't even find it really addressed in any of the scholarship that I tried to find. Thank you.